Imagine a world where the concept of fresh isn't the scent of soap, but the smell of dried herbs masking the musk of 1,000 unwashed days. In medieval England, a hot shower wasn't a luxury, it was a death wish. The body, exposed to water, was seen as a vulnerable gateway for invisible killers carried on the wind. In the biting chill of a 14th century English morning, a person's routine begins not with a roaring faucet, but with the shivering splash of cold water from a simple basin. For the average citizen from London streets to drafty Yorkshire manors, the idea of submerging entirely in water seemed alien, even reckless. Instead, the day began with a dry wash. Standing beside a bed, perhaps on a floor strewn with months-old rushes, a piece of coarse linen is dipped in cold water and rubbed across face and hands. That may be the only water you touch all day. Medical authorities of the time, haunted by the specter of the Black Death, preached grim warnings. Hot water opened the pores, gateways through which the miasma, the deadly pestilential air, could enter and rot the body from within. Grime then wasn't filth, it was a protective sealant against the plague. For the aristocracy, hygiene relied almost entirely on linen. High quality, white linen was believed to act as a biological sponge. Sweat and toxins were drawn out of the pores, locked in fabric, cleaning the body without water. A nobleman might change shirts multiple times a day, proud to display the crisp white edges as a public declaration of wealth and health. Dental hygiene, however, was a harsh affair. Instead of a toothbrush, people used rough linen cloths rubbed with ground salt, crushed bone, or herbs, a painful way to scrape decay from teeth. Toothaches were blamed on worms gnawing at the roots, often treated by a barber surgeon wielding pliers with no anesthesia. Smiles were rarely white, often gapped and always guarded. The air was thick, not with soap, but with musk, rosewater, and spices, masking the unavoidable biological reality of a population living, sleeping, and working in the same unwashed skin. Even the management of waste was a public catastrophe. In castles, toilets, or garderobes were stone benches over moats or cess pits. Fumes killed fleas and moths from fine velvet robes hung nearby. For commoners, pits, buckets, and open gutters created streets that reeked of rot, straw, and animal waste. The gong farmers, brave souls working under cover of darkness, waded waist-deep into human excrement to remove the city's waste. Above ground, pigs scavenged leftovers, adding their droppings to the filth. The medieval city was a living organism of smell and decay. And the tools for personal cleaning? Moss, leaves, hay, and straw, scratchy, ineffective, and often spreading disease further. Parasites thrived in this environment, silently consuming the caloric intake of peasants and townsfolk alike, leaving them weakened in a world where food was already scarce. Yet, in the midst of this biological chaos, the people of medieval England were resilient. Immune systems hardened by constant exposure allowed them to survive diseases that would debilitate modern humans. They relied on herbal medicine, vinegar, and alcohol as natural disinfectants, constrained by the limits of their time. Their hygiene wasn't laziness. It was a desperate, ongoing battle for survival, where cleanliness was a luxury bought through labor and ingenuity, a fight against biology itself. The general populace survived in a haze of musk, dirt, and disease. The wealthy had their own rituals, often just as strange to us today as the peasant methods. For the nobility, hygiene was more about appearance, status, and ritual than actual cleaning. A nobleman's linen was sacred. Shirts were changed multiple times a day, collars and cuffs were starched and pressed, and even the smallest smudge could be seen as a mark of carelessness. The belief in the protective power of linen extended to the entire wardrobe. White undergarments, visible at the edges of doublets or tunics, were symbols of purity and power. Displaying a clean cuff or the top edge of a linen shirt wasn't vanity, it was an announcement to society that you could afford the time, effort, and labor to maintain such a thing. Every stitch, every fold, every crisp line was a signal to peers that you were wealthy, refined, and careful about disease. Bathing, however, remained sporadic. Even nobles were wary of immersing themselves in water. The fear that warm water would open pores to miasma persisted. and so most bathing occurred only a few times a year. When a noble did take a bath, it was often ritualized. Large tubs of heated water might be infused with fragrant herbs, rose petals, or even wine to create the illusion of purification. Sometimes attendants would scrub the noble with cloths and a mixture of herbs, but direct contact with water was still minimal. The emphasis was on the symbolic act, not on actual cleanliness. Perfume became the great equalizer. Musk, rosewater, ambergris, and a variety of oils were applied generously, not just to scent the body but to ward off disease, or so it was believed. Streets of London were replete with competing smells. The odor of the population itself mingled with the fragrance of those who could afford it. A nobleman's scent marked him as different, set apart from the masses. It was an invisible armor, masking the realities of medieval living and proclaiming status at a distance. Dental hygiene remained similarly rudimentary, but slightly more elaborate for those who could afford it. Noble families employed rudimentary toothpicks and linen cloths, often infused with salt or herbs. Still, a cavity meant a visit to the barber surgeon, and extractions were performed without anesthesia. It was a dangerous gamble to maintain teeth. Even nobles accepted missing or blackened teeth as normal, substituting beauty with wealth and power rather than health. Meanwhile, sanitation in castles combined ingenuity and pragmatism with a heavy dose of risk. The garderobe, the noble's toilet, doubled as a chemical weapon against pests. Velvet robes and furs hung alongside the hole, relying on ammonia fumes to prevent infestations. It was an early crude form of sterilization, one that relied on the properties of waste itself. Noble families could afford these measures, commoners could not. For the everyday citizen, the situation was more immediate and terrifying. The streets of towns and cities like London were cesspools. Open gutters carried waste away as best they could, but the lack of drainage, combined with frequent flooding, meant that streets were often coated in layers of excrement, rotting straw, and food waste. Flies were everywhere, spreading disease. The constant exposure made the air thick, almost a physical presence, and the smell could strike you before you even saw the city itself. Communal latrines and wooden buckets were standard, but their maintenance was poor. Those tasked with cleaning, gong farmers, worked under cover of night to avoid public scrutiny. Wading waist-deep in human waste, they removed the accumulated filth with shovels and buckets. Their labor was invisible to most, yet it prevented the city from becoming uninhabitable. The profession was extremely dangerous, and many did not survive long, killed by noxious gases or pathogens. Even in the countryside, sanitation was minimal. Waste was deposited in pits near the house, sometimes covered with straw, but often left to rot openly. People relied on moss, leaves, or hay to clean themselves, and contact with fecal matter was routine. Intestinal parasites were endemic. Almost every adult carried worms, draining strength and causing chronic illness. Children were particularly vulnerable, but they adapted as well, their small bodies building resilience to constant microbial exposure. This was life in the shadow of filth, a constant negotiation with disease, decay, and the limits of human ingenuity. And yet, despite these hardships, medieval people were far from passive. They employed herbs, vinegar, alcohol, and other natural disinfectants to maintain health as best they could. Hygiene was less about comfort and more about survival, a laborious battle waged every day against both the environment and their own biology. Looking back, the contrast between nobles and commoners illustrates more than wealth. It shows a spectrum of adaptation. Both lived in fear of disease and death, but their strategies differed according to their resources. Nobles relied on linen, fragrance, and symbolism, while peasants relied on improvisation, resilience, and exposure-hardened immunity. Each day was a fight to maintain dignity, no matter how grim the reality of the surroundings. Living in medieval England meant more than enduring dirt and foul smells. It meant a constant negotiation with disease. Filth was only one layer of the struggle. Invisible enemies, bacteria, parasites, and viruses lurked everywhere, ready to exploit every weakness in the human body. The miasma theory dominated medical thought. Sickness came not from germs, which were unknown, but from bad air, a toxic, invisible fog of decay and corruption. People feared foul smells not for their own comfort, but for the death that seemed to ride on every stench. The streets of towns were breeding grounds. Rats, attracted to garbage and human waste, scuttled through alleys and homes, carrying fleas infected with the bubonic plague. Flies, drawn to excrement and rotting food, spread disease from one household to another. Without proper waste disposal or understanding of contagion, the cycle of infection was relentless. People became vectors, moving pathogens through markets, streets, and homes without knowing it. In the countryside, life was no easier. Villagers relied on wells and streams for water, which were often contaminated by runoff from nearby latrines or animal pens. A sip of water could mean dysentery or typhoid. A bath could expose someone to additional pathogens. Children played in the dirt, livestock wandered through living areas, and every meal carried the risk of infection. Illness was expected. Survival was a matter of chance, skill, and sheer resilience. Herbal remedies became humanity's first line of defense. Knowledge of plants and their curative properties was vital. Rosemary, thyme, sage, and other herbs were used to make washes, ointments, and infusions. Vinegar, alcohol, and even human urine were employed to disinfect wounds or surfaces. Some households burned herbs in the air to cleanse a room, masking odors while attempting to ward off disease. These methods were primitive, but they were what people had. Survival depended on ingenuity and observation, and those who could read nature often survived longer than those who relied on faith alone. Plague, smallpox, measles, and other epidemics swept through towns and villages with terrifying regularity. Mortality rates were staggering. Entire families could vanish in a single summer. There were no quarantines, no vaccines, and no antibiotics. People turned to prayer, charms, and ritualized cleansing in the hope that divine protection could shield them from invisible death. Yet, even faith offered only partial comfort. Disease did not discriminate. It struck the noble in a velvet robe as easily as the peasant in rags. Animals, too, were both friends and foes. Pigs, chickens, and cattle were essential for food, but they contributed to the spread of disease. Fleas, lice, and other parasites thrived in shared living spaces. Clothing, bedding, and straw, all vital for warmth, harbored insects that fed on humans and animals alike. The itching, irritation, and resulting infections became part of daily life. People slept in layers of grime because it was safer than washing and risking exposure. Dirt, in this grim calculus, was protection. Even food presented hidden dangers. Without refrigeration, spoilage was rapid. Meat was smoked, salted, or pickled, but often imperfectly. Bread could harbor mold. Dairy spoiled within hours. To survive, people developed a keen sense of smell and taste, learning to avoid the visibly rotten, but sometimes that judgment failed. Every meal carried risk. Every bite was a gamble with unseen organisms. The cumulative effect of poor hygiene, contaminated water, pests, and foodborne illness created a population that was constantly under biological pressure. Yet, humans are remarkably adaptive. The immune systems of medieval people, hardened by constant exposure, allowed them to survive diseases that would overwhelm modern humans. Children built immunity through repeated encounters with pathogens. Adults learned the subtle ways to avoid contagion where possible. Medicine itself was a mixture of trial, error, and superstition. Physicians relied on bloodletting, leeches, poultices, and herbal concoctions. Surgical procedures were crude, painful, and risky. Even a small wound could fester, becoming life-threatening. The interplay of hygiene, superstition, and medical practice defined the medieval experience. People survived not because medicine was effective, but because their bodies and societies had learned to endure relentless exposure. Yet despite the ever-present threat of disease, medieval life persisted. Markets thrived, fairs took place, and children laughed in the streets, oblivious to the unseen dangers. Survival demanded vigilance, knowledge, and respect for the invisible enemy that haunted every step. Filth, lice, rats, and poisoned water were not just discomforts, they were teachers shaping habits, customs, and culture. The story of medieval hygiene and disease is not merely one of horror. It is a story of human resilience. Every day, people navigated a world where dirt, odor, and disease were inseparable from life itself. They learned to balance fear and pragmatism, ritual and instinct. They survived, adapted, and even thrived in conditions that modern humans can barely imagine. Step out of the medieval home, or what passes for a home, and you are immediately immersed in the living chaos of the city streets. London, York, or any bustling town of the 14th century was not a quiet, orderly place. It was a sensory onslaught. The cobblestones, uneven and slick with years of accumulated muck, were coated in a mixture of mud, animal waste, decaying food, and human refuse. Walking through them required vigilance lest you slip, trip, or step directly into an invisible hazard. Markets were the lifeblood of the city, but they were also centers of contamination. Vendors hawked meat, fish, vegetables, and baked goods, but hygiene was almost non-existent. Fish were laid out on wooden stalls in the sun, swarming with flies. Meat hung from hooks, often covered with only a thin cloth, or sometimes nothing at all. The stench was overpowering, a mix of rot blood and the sharp tang of vinegar used in a feeble attempt at preservation. Shoppers had to navigate crowds, dodging not only people, but animals. Pigs and dogs roamed freely, scavenging for scraps, sometimes knocking over baskets, spreading further filth. Children, oblivious to danger, played in the alleys and gutters, their feet caked in mud and human waste. They were often carriers of disease, but in this world, childhood innocence was inseparable from exposure. Parents could scold and warn, but they could not change the environment. Even the wealthy who lived in large stone houses or walled estates were not entirely safe. Servants, tradesmen, and visitors brought the city's dirt and germs inside with every step. Water was precious and hazardous. Wells were prone to contamination. Streams that ran through the city carried runoff from latrines and tanneries. Bathing was rare, but water was still essential for cooking and cleaning dishes. People learned to ration it carefully, often boiling or adding vinegar to reduce sickness. But no matter how careful, water could betray them. One sip, one dish, and illness could follow. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid were always a risk. Waste management was both ingenious and horrifying. Gong farmers, the men charged with cleaning out the cesspits, worked under the cover of darkness. They descended into black, rotting pits of human excrement, wading in waist-deep sludge to remove it by hand. Their work was dangerous. The fumes were potent enough to kill, and accidents were frequent. Yet without them, the city would drown in its own filth. Above ground, laws dictated cleanliness, but enforcement was weak. Streets were scraped and swept, but with pigs roaming freely and human waste dumped indiscriminately, the battle was unwinnable. Nobility had some reprieve. Their castles and manor houses had garderobes, primitive toilets with holes over moats or pits, but even these were not sanitized. Velvet robes might hang in the chamber, relying on the ammonia from human waste to kill pests, but they still absorbed odors. When nobles traveled, they carried cloths and perfumes, but they could not escape exposure entirely. The contrast between rich and poor was stark. One group could mask and manage filth, the other lived in it daily. The smell of the streets was unbearable by modern standards. It was not a single odor, but a complex, ever-changing cocktail. The sour bite of rotting straw, the pungent ammonia of urine, the stench of animal dung, and the fermenting decay of food and refuse. Even flowers and herbs, lavender, rosemary, sage, offered only a faint counterpoint. People carried pouches of them, sniffing to ward off disease and disguise the smell of their bodies. Masking odor was survival, not vanity. This sensory landscape shaped every behavior. People adapted their routines, walking along the edges of streets to avoid the worst filth, elevating their feet with thick boots, and using cloths or handkerchiefs to protect noses and mouths. Children grew up immersed in it, building immunity through repeated exposure, learning which corners were safe, which foods could be trusted, and which streets to avoid. The city itself became a teacher of hygiene, even if lessons were harsh. Tradespeople faced their own challenges. Butchers, bakers, tanners, and dyers worked with substances that were foul, corrosive, or infected. Leather tanning involved urine, animal feces, and chemical mixtures that could burn skin. Dyeing cloth required vats of heated liquids, some laced with toxic minerals. Each profession demanded constant negotiation with both filth and chemical hazards. Success and survival required knowledge, caution, and resilience. Yet amid the chaos, human ingenuity flourished. People discovered ways to minimize exposure and use natural resources for protection. Herbs were not just perfumes but disinfectants. Vinegar cleansed surfaces, and alcohol could soothe wounds. Markets and homes were arranged to limit the spread of decay as much as possible. The medieval citizen was both victim and scientist, constantly experimenting, adjusting, and surviving in an environment that modern humans would find unbearable. This world of streets, markets, and public filth was not merely dirty, it was alive. It pulsed with bacteria, insects, and human activity. It taught lessons in survival, adaptation, and resilience. Hygiene was not vanity, it was the difference between life and death. Every choice, where to walk, what to eat, how to clean, carried consequences. Every breath was a calculated risk, and yet people endured. They built communities, celebrated festivals, and lived meaningful lives despite the constant, gnawing threat of disease and decay. After her time in Santa Ana with her father, Elsa Thompson's life took on a quieter rhythm, one that contrasted sharply with the chaos and media frenzy of her childhood. Gone were the headlines, the whispered fears of neighbors, and the courtroom drama that had defined her early years. For Elsa, this period marked both relief and a new set of challenges, the challenge of living a normal life after being defined as anything but normal. Elsa's schooling was one of the first major steps toward stability. She was placed in a local school where her remarkable intelligence quickly became evident. Teachers noted that she read and wrote far above her grade level, demonstrating a capacity for comprehension and articulation that was unusual even for older students. But her brilliance came paired with introspection. Elsa often kept to herself, observing her classmates and the world around her with a quiet intensity. It was as if she were learning how to navigate life after the chaos, one careful observation at a time. In 1935, Elsa married Harry R. Reed, a man who would become her partner in both life and adventure. Reed was ambitious and curious, drawn to exploration and discovery. Unlike the adults who had scrutinized Elsa in her youth, Harry treated her as an equal, valuing her intellect and her perspective. He encouraged her to engage in his projects, from writing to documenting expeditions, giving her opportunities to channel her energy into constructive endeavors rather than being defined by past scandals. One of the most significant episodes of their adult life together came in 1946. Reed led an expedition to Alaska along the newly completed Alcan Highway, a route that promised new opportunities for exploration and scientific observation. Elsa accompanied him, not as a passive companion, but as a writer and chronicler. She meticulously recorded the journey, observing the terrain, noting the behavior of the group, and gathering material for future publications. This work allowed her to exercise her mind in ways that had been impossible during the public scrutiny of her youth, giving her a sense of purpose and independence. Elsa's ability to adapt to a life of relative anonymity demonstrated a resilience that had been forged in the fires of her childhood experiences. While once she had been the center of a sensationalized story, she now operated in a world where her accomplishments, her intellect, and her curiosity defined her identity. She cultivated skills in writing, documentation, and observation, skills that reflected both her natural intelligence and the discipline she had developed over years of navigating complex and often terrifying social situations. Yet, despite this calm surface, questions about her past lingered. Scholars, journalists, and criminologists continued to debate the truth behind her childhood confessions. Could she have been responsible for the deaths of her twin sisters in Canada, Or were those tragic illnesses unrelated to her actions? Did her time with the Platt family, during which they fell ill under mysterious circumstances, involve her in any real harm, or had her story been exaggerated or manipulated by adults? The fact that Elsa retracted her confessions made definitive answers impossible, leaving her early life shrouded in ambiguity. Psychologists examining Elsa's case have suggested multiple explanations for her behavior and confessions. One theory posits that her high intelligence and vivid imagination enabled her to construct elaborate narratives that convinced even trained adults of their truth. Another theory considers the psychological impact of trauma, losing siblings, experiencing the death of caregivers, and enduring repeated relocations, which may have influenced her storytelling. Others propose that adult manipulation played a role, whether from her mother, boarding families, or authority figures seeking sensational stories. Likely, the reality combined all these factors, creating a child capable of presenting a tale that was disturbingly detailed, yet perhaps not entirely true. As she moved through adulthood, Elsa embraced a life of quiet productivity. She wrote, traveled, and participated in her husband's expeditions. The media that had once painted her as a prodigy of evil no longer followed her, allowing her to define her identity on her own terms. This shift from public spectacle to private life marked a profound transformation, one that allowed Elsa to reclaim agency over her story, even if the shadow of her past lingered in occasional recollections or scholarly investigations. Her story serves as a powerful lesson on the complexities of childhood, intelligence, and the human mind. It illustrates how early trauma, societal expectations, and adult influence can intertwine to produce narratives that challenge our understanding of morality, accountability, and perception. Elsa Thompson's life shows that the line between imagination and reality, innocence and culpability, is often far more nuanced than the public or even experts might assume. By the time she reached later adulthood, Elsa had established a stable, productive, and relatively anonymous life. She remained married to Harry Reid, contributing to his exploratory projects, and lived free from the public scrutiny that had so intensely shaped her early years. Her intellectual capacity, once feared or misunderstood, became a tool for documenting, observing, and reflecting on the world around her. The girl once labeled a baby Borge had become a woman capable of directing her narrative, creating meaning from experience, and living a life that contrasted sharply with the darkness and suspicion of her youth. Elsa Thompson's story leaves us with lingering questions we may never answer fully. Was she a manipulative child with sinister intent, or a brilliant, traumatized young girl shaped by circumstance and adult influence? Did she truly harm others, or were her confessions partly the product of imagination and coercion? These uncertainties remind us that history often exists in shades of gray, and that the lives of children, particularly those under scrutiny, can be far more complex than initial appearances suggest. What we do know is this: Elsa survived, she lived, she learned to navigate a world that had once labeled her a monster, and she found a way to leave behind the shadows of sensationalized headlines. And in doing so, she transformed from a figure of horror into a figure of resilience, a person who survived extraordinary circumstances and carved a path defined by intellect, observation, and quiet determination. After stepping away from the glare of Hollywood newspapers and sensationalized courtrooms, Elsa Thompson entered a world that was quieter, yet no less complex. Her life in Santa Ana with her father offered a rare opportunity: the chance to exist without constant scrutiny, without reporters dissecting every word or action. For a girl whose childhood had been defined by fear, tragedy, and suspicion, this calm was almost revolutionary. Elsa's father, Russell Thompson, was determined to protect her and to give her a chance at a normal upbringing. He enrolled her in local schools, where her extraordinary intelligence quickly became apparent. Though just 7 years old when she had captured the attention of Los Angeles authorities, Elsa could read, write, and reason at a level far beyond her peers. Teachers remarked on her sharp memory, her ability to recall details with uncanny precision, and her capacity to engage in advanced arithmetic and grammar. It was clear she was no ordinary child, but what was extraordinary about her mind did not automatically equate to evil. Socially, Elsa remained reserved. She observed more than she participated, watching classmates interact with a careful, analytical eye. For a child who had survived public interrogation and media hysteria, discretion was second nature. She learned quickly that words and actions could be interpreted in ways that were not always fair, and she became adept at navigating the world with caution. At home, her father encouraged creativity and curiosity, giving her books, writing materials, and later, access to travel and exploration through family connections. In 1935, Elsa married Harry R. Reed, a classmate she had known from her teenage years. Reed was ambitious, adventurous, and intellectually curious, qualities that complemented Elsa's analytical mind. Unlike the adults who had once scrutinized and in some ways exploited her, Harry treated Elsa as a partner and collaborator. He encouraged her to write, to document their experiences, and to contribute meaningfully to his work as an explorer. For Elsa, this partnership offered freedom, the freedom to channel her intelligence into creative and constructive endeavors. One of the most remarkable chapters of their adult life came with the 1946 Alaskan expedition along the newly completed Alkan Highway. The journey promised both adventure and opportunity for research, and Elsa accompanied Harry not as a mere companion, but as a chronicler. She documented the expedition meticulously, noting the geography, climate, and the interactions among the team. Her observations reflected both her intellect and her curiosity, qualities that had been evident even in her childhood, though they had been overshadowed by fear and suspicion. Life during this period was productive, though far from glamorous. Elsa and Harry lived modestly, focusing on their work, travel, and writing. The media that had once painted her as a potential child murderer no longer followed her, leaving her the space to define herself on her own terms. She gradually built a life that was rich in experience and learning, contrasting sharply with the chaos of her early years. Psychologists and historians have debated Elsa's early confessions extensively. Some have suggested that her tales of poisoning and harming family members were the result of a vivid imagination, combined with the trauma of losing siblings and experiencing frequent upheaval. Others have pointed to the possibility of adult influence, whether from her mother, her caretakers, or even the Platt family, who may have unintentionally or deliberately shaped her narrative for attention or explanation. The truth is likely a complex mixture of all these factors, creating a story that was at once believable, terrifying, and difficult to verify. Despite the lingering mystery of her childhood, Elsa's adult life demonstrated resilience and adaptability. She pursued intellectual endeavors, writing articles and documenting experiences, often using her extraordinary memory and attention to detail to preserve historical and exploratory knowledge. Her participation in Harry's expeditions showed her ability to operate in challenging environments, applying both practical skills and mental acuity. Her story also highlights the broader societal attitudes of the time. In the early 20th century, children, especially girls, were often assumed to be innocent or alternatively inherently mischievous depending on circumstance. Elsa's case challenged these assumptions. Her intelligence, combined with her early exposure to tragedy, public scrutiny, and inconsistent adult guidance, created a narrative that fascinated, horrified, and perplexed both professionals and the general public. Yet by the time she reached adulthood, Elsa had largely escaped that narrative, living a life defined not by past suspicions but by her capabilities, choices, and experiences. While she rarely spoke publicly about her early life, it is clear that Elsa never returned to the sensationalized path of her childhood. She embraced privacy, scholarship, and adventure, redefining herself in ways that contrasted sharply with her portrayal as a baby Borge in newspapers. Through travel, writing, and her partnership with Harry Reid, she demonstrated that intelligence and curiosity could be powerful tools for personal growth and societal contribution, rather than instruments of fear or malice. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Elsa Thompson Reed had effectively disappeared from public attention. She lived a life of quiet accomplishment, contributing to exploration literature and documenting experiences that would have been lost without her meticulous records. To the outside world, she had become nearly invisible, a stark contrast to the intense scrutiny she had endured as a child. Yet, the lessons of her story remained, a cautionary tale of how childhood trauma, intelligence, and adult influence can intersect to create narratives that are difficult to untangle. Ultimately, Elsa's life after the headlines illustrates the possibility of transformation and redemption. From a child under suspicion and public scrutiny, she became an adult defined by her intellect, her contributions to exploration, and her ability to shape her own narrative. The question of what truly happened during her early years may never be answered fully, but Elsa's resilience and adaptability demonstrate that even those thrust into the harshest public spotlight can reclaim agency over their lives. Her story invites reflection on justice, childhood, and society's fascination with morality. Was Elsa guilty or a victim of circumstance and adult influence? Perhaps we will never know. What is certain is that she survived, adapted, and lived a life far removed from the sensationalism that once threatened to define her forever. After the Alaskan expedition and the years of travel with her husband, Elsa Thompson Reed settled into a life that was far quieter than the one she had known as a child. Gone were the days of sensational headlines, public fascination, and courtroom drama. She and Harry lived modestly, moving between small towns and cities as he pursued his work as an explorer, while Elsa focused on documenting their experiences, writing articles, and keeping detailed journals. Her journals revealed a side of Elsa that few people ever saw, a reflective, analytical, and profoundly curious mind. She wrote not only about geography, wildlife, and the practicalities of travel, but also about the people they met, the cultures they observed, and her own internal reflections. Some passages show a humor and lightness that were unimaginable in the dark, dramatic narratives of her childhood. In others, there is a sharpness, an attention to detail, and a keen understanding of human behavior that hints at the extraordinary intellect that had once made her both feared and fascinating. Elsa became an advocate quietly for careful observation and intellectual inquiry. While she never returned to public attention in the sensationalized way that marked her childhood, she did engage with writers, researchers, and explorers who recognized her skill in documentation and her ability to recall information with near-perfect accuracy. She became, in many ways, a behind-the-scenes contributor to exploration literature and historical accounts. Her life also reflects the profound resilience of the human spirit. A child once suspected of murder and described in newspapers as a baby Borge, Elsa transformed into an adult capable of profound intellectual and creative contributions. She avoided the pitfalls that often trap highly intelligent children, social isolation, misunderstanding, or legal persecution, and instead carved out a world in which she could thrive, independent of the chaos of her early years. Psychologists who later studied Elsa's story often debated whether her childhood confessions were the product of a disturbed mind, imagination, or coercion. Some argued that she had been influenced by adults around her, by her mother's theatrical ambitions, by the caretakers she lived with, and even by the intense attention from law enforcement. Others suggested that her intellectual precocity and early exposure to death and suffering gave her a perspective that few children could truly comprehend, resulting in stories that were terrifyingly detailed, yet not necessarily factual. Regardless of the truth, Elsa's adult life suggests that human behavior is profoundly shaped by environment, circumstance, and opportunity. She demonstrated that intelligence, when combined with guidance and stability, can lead to remarkable achievements. She used the same observational skills that had once made authorities doubt and fear her to navigate life carefully, to contribute meaningfully, and to maintain a life of privacy and fulfillment. In the mid-20th century, Elsa and Harry continued to travel extensively. Their trips included regions of the United States rarely explored at the time, as well as journeys abroad to document natural phenomena, study local communities, and gather material for publications. Elsa's writing became increasingly sophisticated, blending factual reportage with personal reflection. She described challenges, both practical and emotional, with clarity and honesty. Her work caught the attention of fellow researchers, though she never sought fame. She seemed content with the quiet knowledge that her work mattered, even if the public never knew her name. Letters and articles preserved from this time show that Elsa retained a fascination with human behavior and morality. She often reflected on childhood, not as a period of horror, but as a stage in which the potential for growth, misunderstanding, and resilience is immense. In private notes, she acknowledged her early notoriety, but rarely dwelled on it. Instead, she framed her experiences as lessons, emphasizing the importance of observation, empathy, and self-discipline. Elsa's story also intersects with broader societal questions about childhood, responsibility, and justice. She became, in hindsight, an example of how society can misinterpret or sensationalize the actions of children, particularly those with advanced intellects or unconventional circumstances. Her case was often cited in discussions of juvenile justice and psychiatric evaluation, highlighting the difficulties of discerning truth from narrative in cases involving young children and traumatic environments. Despite the media frenzy of her youth, Elsa appears to have lived her adult life largely free from scandal. She and Harry raised a family, contributed to exploration and writing, and engaged with communities in meaningful ways. Her intelligence, once a source of fear and speculation, became a tool for understanding the world and for shaping her own destiny. By the time she reached her later years, Elsa Thompson Reed had crafted a life that was quiet, productive, and intellectually fulfilling. She lived long enough to see the mid-century world change dramatically, scientifically, culturally, and socially, and she observed these changes with the same curiosity and analytical rigor that had characterized her youth. Though the shadows of her early notoriety remained in historical records, they did not define her. Instead, Elsa's life serves as a testament to human adaptability, resilience, and the possibility of redemption. Her story raises uncomfortable but important questions. How much of a child's narrative is influenced by adults? How do trauma, intelligence, and opportunity intersect to create perceptions of morality or malevolence? Elsa's life suggests that the answers are rarely simple. Yet, it also suggests hope. Even those whose early lives are marked by fear, suspicion, or tragedy can create meaningful, positive, and lasting contributions to the world. In the end, Elsa Thompson Reed is remembered not as a child accused of monstrous acts, but as an adult who lived fully, observed keenly, and contributed thoughtfully. The baby Borge of newspapers faded, replaced by a woman whose life reflected curiosity, intellect, and quiet accomplishment. And perhaps that is the most remarkable aspect of all: the transformation of public perception, the reclaiming of agency, and the creation of a life defined not by fear or scandal, but by resilience, intellect, and purpose. As Elsa Thompson Reed grew older, her life took on a reflective quality. The extraordinary events of her childhood, the sensational headlines, the confessions, the public scrutiny, were far behind her. Yet they never fully disappeared from public memory. Historians, journalists, and criminologists continued to examine her case, trying to reconcile the sharp contrast between the terrifying accounts of her youth and the calm, accomplished life she led as an adult. Elsa herself rarely spoke publicly about her childhood. In private letters, however, she hinted at the weight of growing up under scrutiny. She wrote of the confusion she felt when adults around her either imposed their fears onto her or attempted to control her behavior in ways she did not fully understand. There is evidence that she recognized the influence that adults had in shaping not only her behavior, but also the narrative surrounding her actions. Whether her early confessions were fabricated, coerced, or the product of imagination remains unknown. Despite this uncertainty, one thing is clear: Elsa's intellect and capacity for observation never waned. She remained meticulous in her writing, carefully noting details in her travel journals and scientific observations. Her reports from Alaska, the American West, and other remote regions are filled with precise measurements, keen observations of wildlife, and thoughtful analyses of human communities. She seemed to have found a space in life where her intelligence could flourish without the fear and misunderstanding that had marked her early years. Yet, the shadow of her childhood lingered in more subtle ways. Elsa occasionally reflected on morality, justice, and the complexity of human behavior. In some of her later writings, she posed questions that might have been inspired by her own experiences. How does society judge innocence and guilt in children? To what extent can a child's imagination be mistaken for reality? How do adults' fears and expectations shape the way children behave, or how their actions are interpreted? These reflections suggest that Elsa had not forgotten the intense scrutiny she had endured, and that she understood the larger societal implications of her story. The mystery of Elsa's early confessions continues to provoke debate. Some experts argue that her descriptions of poisoning glass shards and battery acid were likely fabrications influenced by her environment. Children are highly suggestible, and Elsa had been exposed to a series of adults who warned her about the dangers of everyday items. It is possible that she internalized these warnings and, through storytelling, created a narrative that seemed believable enough to convince police and medical professionals. Others contend that Elsa may have been capable of actions that were extreme, but not necessarily homicidal. The deaths of her infant sisters could have been natural, as suggested by some physicians at the time, but her detailed knowledge of poisons and her later behavior toward the Platt family raises unsettling questions. Could a child of 7 really have learned to manipulate chemical substances in a way that made people ill? Did she act out of curiosity, malice, or simply an experimental drive that children often possess in a more innocent form? The reality may lie somewhere between these extremes. Elsa's childhood was marked by instability, trauma, and exposure to death and illness. Her parents' separation, the deaths of her sisters, and her repeated displacement from household to household created a unique and highly stressful environment. Such conditions can produce a range of behaviors in children, from extreme creativity and intelligence to manipulative tendencies and a blurred understanding of cause and effect. Even decades later, Elsa's story is revisited in discussions about juvenile justice and child psychology. She is often cited as an example of how complex, multifaceted, and fragile childhood development can be. Her case underscores the difficulty of determining accountability in young children, especially when their intellect, imagination, and environment collide in unusual ways. Elsa's later years were quiet, yet filled with purpose. She and her husband lived in Santa Ana and later in other towns in California. They maintained a modest lifestyle focused on writing, travel, and family. Elsa's contributions to exploration, literature, and documentation, though not widely publicized, reflect the disciplined, observant, and reflective mind that had first emerged in her youth. Her ability to navigate life after such a turbulent and public childhood speaks to remarkable resilience. In examining Elsa's life, one cannot ignore the contrast between the public perception of her as a baby Borge and the woman she became. The terrifying accounts of her childhood, stories of poisoning, glass shards, and battery acid, dominate historical memory. Yet, Elsa's adult life reveals a person who lived quietly, thoughtfully, and with purpose. She is a testament to the idea that early life trauma, fear, or notoriety does not necessarily dictate the trajectory of a person's life. Ultimately, Elsa Thompson Reed's story remains a study in ambiguity. It raises enduring questions about the nature of childhood, the interpretation of confessions, and the impact of environment on behavior. Was Elsa truly guilty of the act she described, or was she a child caught in the web of adult expectation, suggestion, and societal fascination? We may never know the full truth. What is certain, however, is that Elsa lived a life defined by observation, intellect, and quiet accomplishment, reclaiming her narrative from the sensationalized headlines of her youth. Her story reminds us that the line between fact and fiction, innocence and guilt, can be impossibly thin when it comes to children, and that even in cases shrouded in mystery, resilience and intellect can prevail. Elsa Thompson Reed passed away, having lived fully, leaving behind writings, travel notes, and accounts that continue to intrigue scholars and enthusiasts alike. Her story is a haunting reminder of the complexities of human behavior, particularly in children, and a testament to the enduring capacity for reinvention, reflection, and redemption. Elsa Thompson Reed's story, though largely forgotten by the general public, has never disappeared from historical and psychological discourse. Over time, researchers, criminologists, and child psychologists have revisited her case, trying to untangle fact from fiction, myth from reality. The sensational nature of her childhood confessions, combined with the ambiguity surrounding their truth, makes her a uniquely fascinating figure in both criminal history and the study of child development. The case has become a lens through which we can examine the delicate intersection of environment, intelligence, and behavior. Elsa's early life was characterized by trauma, instability, and repeated exposure to death. Her twin sisters died when she was very young, her parents separated, and she was moved between households multiple times. These disruptions may have contributed to a heightened sense of observation and a capacity to mimic or dramatize behavior she had seen or imagined. The fact that she provided detailed descriptions of poisonings and other harmful acts, while also maintaining an obedient and polite demeanor, challenges traditional assumptions about how children express emotion, guilt, and responsibility. One of the most haunting aspects of Elsa's story is the question of manipulation. Could she have been influenced by adults, her mother, Mrs. Steele, or even Mrs. Platt, to fabricate stories that seemed believable to authorities? Children, especially those with advanced intellects like Elsa, can be highly suggestible. They observe adult reactions closely, learn the ways in which certain stories elicit attention or approval, and may replicate or exaggerate those narratives. In Elsa's case, her storytelling could have been both a survival mechanism and a reflection of the adults around her, a combination of imagination, fear, and adaptive intelligence. Despite the uncertainties, Elsa's life after childhood paints a picture of resilience. She transitioned into adulthood, quietly marrying her former classmate Harry, Reed, and traveling extensively. Her writings from these travels reveal a keen, meticulous mind. She documented landscapes, wildlife, and social conditions with precision and care. These endeavors suggest that Elsa's early intellect and capacity for observation, once potentially misinterpreted or feared, were channeled into constructive and productive pursuits. Her story also raises enduring questions about justice and child psychology. How do we evaluate a child's culpability when intelligence, imagination, and trauma intersect in extreme ways? In Elsa's time, the legal and psychiatric systems were unprepared to fully understand or accommodate such complexity. Modern psychologists might approach her case differently, considering factors such as post-traumatic stress, environmental stressors, and developmental psychology. Today, Elsa's childhood confessions might be analyzed for suggestion, coercion, and cognitive development, potentially altering our perception of guilt and intent. Another dimension of Elsa's legacy lies in the public's fascination with evil children. Her case continues to be cited in discussions of juvenile criminality, moral development, and the psychology of children who engage in extraordinary or alarming behavior. Unlike fictional depictions of evil children, Sid Michael Myers' Samara, Elsa's story is grounded in real-life ambiguity. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Can a child truly understand the consequences of their actions? How much responsibility belongs to the child versus the adults shaping their environment? And how does society interpret and sensationalize such cases? Elsa's life also demonstrates the capacity for reinvention and the power of obscurity. After moving to Santa Ana with her husband, she disappeared from the public eye, living a private life focused on family, travel, and writing. Unlike the sensationalized headlines of her youth, her adulthood was quiet and law-abiding. It is a reminder that early notoriety, even when intense and public, does not always define the course of a person's life. Resilience, intellect, and opportunity can allow individuals to reclaim their narrative even after a childhood shrouded in fear and scandal. Her story is a study in contrasts. On one hand, We have the young Elsa, whose confessions alarmed the nation, whose tales of glass shards, ant paste, and battery acid seemed almost impossible for a 7-year-old to concoct. On the other, we have Elsa Thompson-Reed, a reflective, intelligent adult who lived a productive life and contributed meaningfully to exploration and literature. The gap between these two realities fuels ongoing fascination and speculation. Historians continue to debate the truth of Elsa's childhood claims. Did she commit the acts she confessed to, or were they purely imaginative creations influenced by adult authority figures? Some point to the specificity of her confessions as evidence of truth, noting the detailed descriptions of substances, methods, and effects. Others argue that children are capable of crafting elaborate stories, particularly under pressure or scrutiny, and that trauma may heighten creativity and storytelling ability. The real answer may never be known. What remains undeniable is that Elsa Thompson-Reed's story has left a lasting impact. It challenges our understanding of childhood morality and the capacity for both harm and adaptation. It reminds us that early life experiences, while formative, are not always predictive of adult behavior. And it highlights the ways in which society, media, and authority figures shape the narrative surrounding children, sometimes with long-lasting consequences. In the end, Elsa's life embodies both mystery and resilience. She navigated a childhood filled with tragedy and suspicion, survived public scrutiny, and ultimately carved a life marked by observation, writing, and reflection. Her story is as much about human complexity as it is about crime, and it continues to provoke thought, debate, and fascination to this day.